Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Michael Penn. I'm the Vice President of the club. I will be your moderator today. I should say this morning. As we probably all know, it's a very beautiful morning, but ice cold. And we have a topic today which I hope will warm you up and to give you a chance to ask some good questions. Our guest is the Ambassador of Ukraine to Japan, Ambassador Kharchenko. He has been a guest frequently this year. I think we were discussing this is probably his third appearance here during the course of the year, and for very good reason, because the events which are going on in his country are of world significance and of specific significance to Japan as well. He will be giving an update on what has been happening lately, and there has been some very dramatic developments. Also, from the Japanese perspective, we've been reading that the Abe administration is trying to still have President Putin of Russia come to this country and trying to negotiate the situation of what the Japanese call the Northern Territories. So this faraway event is also very close to Japan and Japan's interests. Before we get started, I might add that the ambassador has generously donated 3 books to the FCCJ library, including a very spectacular book of photography, which certainly makes me want to go to Ukraine. And maybe in the future, many of us will get the chance. So I will now turn it over to the ambassador for his update. And please listen, and then after that, you'll have a chance to ask him questions. Thank you very much. And if you have a phone, please put it on some sort of manner mode so it doesn't make strange noises while the ambassador's talking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for a warm introduction. Third this year, rightly pointed out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Once again, to hear from Ukrainian ambassador on the development in Ukraine. But I want to start, since we have gathered in the very special time of the year. It is pre-Christmas time. Obviously, even in Japan, despite not being a Christian country, you have this Christmas fever. And my initial remark would be to wish everyone present here and your families, all members of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan, Merry Christmas, happy, prosperous, and of course peaceful New Year. I would wish that to my homeland also. Peace, prosperity, and luck in the upcoming year. To start with, I think I should wrap up briefly what is, in my view, the most important development in and around Ukraine since I think we met last time, happened several months ago. I will start with what our chairman has quoted, the importance of what's happening in and around Ukraine today, not only for people of my country, but also for governments and peoples all around the world. Using Prime Minister's Abe quote, it matters for Japan what happens in Ukraine. Not only for Japan, I would argue. It had been mentioned that for the first time since Second World War, Ukrainian territory became a battleground again. Who would imagine that Ukraine would be fighting against Russia this time? And Germany would be helping Ukraine. I mean, the normal historian would have his hair put up at reading such news some 5-6 years ago. But that's the reality we are living through. Now, the development in the course of the last several months, I think, should be started with mentioning that at the beginning of September in Minsk, a document was agreed, which is called the Minsk Memorandum, which led to the so-called ceasefire agreement. Backside of this story is that since September this year, that ceasefire had been violated by Russian and terrorist side some more than 1,100 times. And more than 1,000 people were killed during that time of the ceasefire. Jumping several months to the last week, today we have the new regime, which is called the silence. It lasts for 4 days already, and fighting is mostly stopped, despite some sporadic fighting, and that is the situation on the front. Actually, what happened in the meantime after the establishment of that so-called ceasefire, the inception of mission of the OSCE monitoring group in Ukraine to supervise the ceasefire on the ground. Ukraine had a very important political development in October, snap elections. Japan had snap elections just recently last week, but I would argue that Ukrainian elections were more dramatic and from the point of view of general outcome, for the future development of the whole region, much more important. Ukraine had elected new parliament. One distinctive feature of this new parliament is that I think for the first time in several decades, actually from 1918, Ukrainian parliament, or Ukrainian highest legislative body, does not have any single representative of the former ruling party of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party. We don't have any more communists in the Ukrainian parliament, which is, from our perspective, an extremely outstanding achievement. 2/3 of the current composition of the parliament is formed by members of 5 blocs and parties who position themselves as pro-Western and pro-democratic. And this is also, once again, for the first time in 23 years of Ukrainian regained independence, the 2/3 clear-cut pro-Western majority had been formed in the Ukrainian parliament. Another important political development, it happened just a couple of weeks ago. The new government was formed in Ukraine after these elections have taken place. And the former, the so-called kamikaze government, which came to power in late February this year, is substituted with what some Ukrainian journalists are dubbing Kamikaze 2 government, because this new government is supposed to be the most pro-reformist and self-killing government in Ukrainian history. The government program had already been publicized, and it is really a program of a drastic, dramatic reform. Economic, political, legislative. The main thrust of that reform is bringing Ukrainian economic, political, and legal system tuned speedily to the standards of the European Union norms and principles with a view to accelerate the full implementation of the association agreement which Ukraine had signed in June this year. And just on the margins, it was only yesterday that the first meeting of that Association Council, European Union, Ukraine, has taken place in Brussels. And it had been announced that the full implementation of that agreement is expected by the end of the year 2015. To name interesting facts about this new Ukrainian government, I would only name that for the first time also in Ukrainian history we have, well, foreign nationals running ministerial positions in the government. We have 3 ministers of the government coming from 3 different countries in the world. They all had to give up with their original nationality to become Ukrainian citizens, because according to our legislation, you can't get the civil service job if you're a foreigner. It's a standard practice. But anyway, we have an American of Ukrainian origin running as the finance minister of Ukraine. We have Georgian of Georgian origin, but turned Ukrainian national running the health ministry. And we have a Lithuanian of Lithuanian origin, but who'd been living for a long time in Ukraine and who had to give up his EU citizenship to acquire Ukrainian citizenship, running as Minister of Economy of Ukraine, which is brand new for Ukrainian psyche. More is expected to come. A very dynamic President Poroshenko, who had been elected several months ago, is seeking top world expertise all around the world, including in such places as regionally close to here, Singapore, with its experience of creating sound legal system. He paid a visit there last week to learn. Australia, United States, Canada. Before the end of the year, Ukrainian parliament should look at the program of these reforms and approve it, and also approve the budget for the year 2015, which are the most important, I think, political benchmarks for Ukraine in the remaining before Christmas days to come. That is on politics inside Ukraine. On what's happening outside. Despite the continuous and numerous appeals to the Russian side in the course of last several months, including during high-level important political meetings, just to name one in Milan, one in Brisbane at the top level. The calls were to abide by what had been agreed in Minsk by memorandum on ceasefire, on the withdrawal of troops, on securing the monitoring of the Ukrainian border, and all the agreed items of that Minsk memorandum. But so far, that also includes numerous telephone calls, conversations with the current leader of the Russian Federation. So far, situation on the ground remains highly volatile, and what we may account for is that practically nothing of the agreed steps had been completely fulfilled by the Russian side. That brought Ukrainian government several weeks ago to the important decision of stopping any finance of the territories temporarily occupied by terrorist groups supported by the Russian government, which creates extremely dangerous humanitarian situation in some parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk region. Very recently, yes, and because of that unreadiness of the Russian side to go along with what had been agreed, the international response to Russian politics had been implementing the third package of sanctions against the Russian Federation, with the view of probable expansion of sanctions in the nearest future. The issue of further sanctions will be considered, I think, tomorrow. Tomorrow is Thursday, once again in Brussels, unless Kremlin rethinks its policies. Diplomacy is also a tool which is widely used. When coming here to this meeting, I just read the news dispatch about a recent conversation held several hours ago between President Poroshenko, Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande of France, and the leader of the Russian Federation, devoted entirely to situation in some parts of the Donbas region, with the view of calling another meeting of the so-called Minsk group in the nearest future. That is so far the end of the very latest diplomatic activity to this end. And some observers claim that there are signs of some understanding on the Russian side that really they need to do more. We heard some remarks yesterday or a couple of days ago from Secretary of State Kerry after his meeting in Rome with his Russian counterpart. We heard from Chancellor Merkel. We'll see what the end of this year brings about. Ukraine stands ready to continue this diplomatic effort. President Poroshenko once again had confirmed that he is devoted to his peace plan, but in order to have a peace plan being implemented, you need two to tango. Means two sides should be fully implementing all the provisions of the agreement. And it just coincided that this recent diplomatic activity around this situation in the eastern part of Ukraine had coincided with some economic news which are coming 3 days in a row from Moscow. And that is, I think, we've been referring to this issue at our previous meetings, also here in this club, that the tool or the weapon which Ukrainian partners in what we call civilized world had chosen to make influence on Russia, that is economic sanctions, they started to pay. They work slowly, but I think in a recent couple of days, visibility of this weapon, if I may, not the hot weapon, but economic weapon, is becoming more and more visible even for an average Russian, which we strongly hope, and Ukraine will make finally a strong input on the mindset of the current Russian leadership. Hope is that the new year, Ukraine will meet in peace. Hope is that Russian leadership will understand, finally, that this adventure with the annexation of Crimea, this adventure with military invasion in the east of Ukraine, may not only topple the current regime in Russia, but it also puts a big question mark on what Russia may become after. Such questions are being put by many experts recently. For Ukraine, these are issues of huge importance. Russia had always been our neighbor, probably the uneasiest of them all, and as we understand it, will remain its neighbor, our neighbor. And as any peace-loving nation, we want to live in peace with neighbors. I will end up this brief recall of what, in my view, is the most important development in Ukraine in recent months with still a call that in that hybrid war which Russia is waging against Ukraine since April, basically since March, Ukraine had felt an absolutely outstanding international support. As of today, I think about 41 nations of the world had imposed sanctions on Russia. Including several days ago, we heard from Japanese government that Japan had also expanded sanctions to Crimean companies in connection with the situation with Russian behavior. We do not exclude that further influencing will be needed. One thing is sparing lives of those who live there, sparing lives of Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers, and those who were tricked into joining these terrorist military groups for obviously unclear ideas. And the other thing is to bring reason to current Russian leadership. Ukraine alone may only fight, which it did. To put a nuclear power, which is still holding its position as one of the members of the United Nations Security Council. I'm not mentioning it because United Nations Security Council had been meeting for more than 20 times in the course of last month with no effect to situation in the eastern part of Ukraine for only one reason. We have Russia there on the seat. For bringing reason to current Russian leadership, we'll need still concerted international effort. And we need not only that international effort in terms of diplomacy, economics, we also need it in terms of delivering adequate information about what's happening there. Because one part of that hybrid warfare which Russia is waging is huge informational warfare. Huge. Absolutely unprecedented in world history. As we understand now, one of the ideas is to reach globally the audiences for Russia for the next year. And in that sense, every opinion of truth, reality, and openness is very much appreciated. Ukraine is open. Ukraine is wishing and struggling for peace. Ukraine is still in need of support. And I would be ready to answer any sort of question to the best of my knowledge so far. And with your permission, I will stop here with my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for giving us that introduction to set the stage for our questions, and also for keeping it almost exactly on the perfect timing for an opening discussion. At this time, I will be opening the floor to questions. The microphone is over here, and if you raise your hands, I'll call on you, and when I do, please come to the microphone, give your name and affiliation, and ask your questions. So the floor is now open. I'm looking for hands. Yes, sir.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Masakatsu Ishii from Jiji Press. I have two questions. Even Japan has taken sanctions against Russia. I think Abe administration takes conciliatory attitude towards Russia. So even Mr. Abe phoned Mr. Putin and celebrated birthday. Don't you irritated with such approach? Of Japanese government? And one more question. President Poroshenko visited recently Singapore. So is there any possibility the president will visit Japan to discuss this crisis? Thank you.
Shall I react immediately?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for questions. First, on irritation. No, I'm not in any degree irritated. Moreover, I do understand the position of the government of Japan. I will tell you more. If I just put off my shoes as the Ukrainian ambassador and imagine myself in the shoes of some counselor to the Japanese government, I would probably advise the same along the lines of what the Japanese government is doing. I mean, you have a neighbor, huge one, sometimes unpredictable. We have the same neighbor. And I was just delivering what we're having with this neighbor recently, in recent months. And you have the problem, historical problem, with that neighbor, which dates back to the years of the World War II. You have the case after war was over. We have the war. I strongly hope that what Prime Minister Abe had publicly stated several times, the Japanese government would be keen on finding the final solution over the northern territories, will come true. That's the answer to the first question. And second, on possibility of visits. Yes, we have plans for high-level, top-level contacts between Ukraine and Japan. Not for this year. We have roughly less than 2 weeks before the end of this year, but it is important to mention that this year President Poroshenko had already met Prime Minister Abe, and they've been discussing also the situation in eastern part of Ukraine and future cooperation. They have agreed on further contacts. I'm in no position to now disclose the dating. It is important that Foreign Minister Kishida had also paid visit this summer to Ukraine, so we keep close political contacts between governments of Ukraine and Japan. Let me finish answering in that more will be coming in the year 2015, including at the top level. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Well, while they're thinking about how to phrase their question, I'll hit you with a question here to follow up on what this gentleman asked. You know, clearly you're in regular contact with the foreign ministry. You're talking to them about this issue, I would imagine, quite regularly. In general, I mean, I know that you can't get into specific diplomatic secrets or anything, but in general, what is the message that you're trying to impress upon the Japanese government at this time, and what are they saying to you in return? How is that dialogue going?
I'm thinking about the diplomatic type of answering. I will use this opportunity once again to express our gratitude for the government of Japan for all support and assistance it had been granting to Ukraine since spring this year. Yes, we are in very close contacts, and the only thing I may reveal is that requests which the Ukrainian government is passing from time to time, including political, some logistical, some other, some diplomatic, normally gain very good response. And we strongly hope that this type of partnership and cooperation will continue in future. Didn't I mention that Japan, of course, as a part of the G7 group, was the close collaborator in developing this hard stance which the G7 has taken on Russia's politics. Japan, of course, is a very important part of the security architecture in this part of the world. And also having this extremely important internal development with the constitution is looking now, I would argue, more globally the security architecture around the world because it matters. What happens in Ukraine today is, once again, not only matters for Ukraine. What we have today is the huge shake, I would even argue shattering, to the whole security architecture the world had since the Second World War. Its basics are now at stake. So for Ukraine only to find a solution to this huge security crisis, I think it is impossible. We need concerted action, we see that absolutely impotent United Nations Security Council once again. And I'm now talking about politics only and diplomacy. But look at the other side. Japan had for years been the champion of nuclear-free world. Japanese diplomacy is distinctive in that sense. It's very close to the hearts of Japanese people for obvious reasons. I've been to Hiroshima myself several times. Now, just look at the situation. Russia, which had signed back in 1994, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, the Budapest Memorandum on security assurances to Ukraine, vis-à-vis Ukraine's giving up of nuclear weapons. Russia, which was supposed to guarantee territorial integrity of Ukraine by this memorandum. I was in Budapest at that time. I was partially drafting that memorandum. I remember that story very vividly. I remember Boris Yeltsin there and all the negotiations late at night. Now look what's happening. Russia is violating not only that memorandum, okay, but all basic treaties. Now what comes from Lavrov yesterday? Russia says it has a right to put nuclear weapons in Crimea. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what I would call even not a politics. Some experts put it's a madhouse. I especially brought with me a souvenir which the international organization called Greenpeace gave me in the year 2003. It has a date here. It has as an ace of hearts the biggest nuclear dangers in the world. Ace of hearts. One man, Vladimir Putin, dated back 2003.
You'd better keep that out for the photographers at the end of the press conference.
Now I read the news line once again. Russia says it has a right to put nuclear weapons in Crimea. On the backside of the story that Russia is supporting terrorists in Ukraine, is actually behaving like a terrorist state itself. Now it's adverting to nuclear terrorism. All these issues, I'm still answering your question, are in the talking points list of our conversations with the Japanese government. And once again, using this opportunity to express my appreciation of the very wise and the only possible to my understanding, position with the Japanese government had taken on these issues related to security situation in Ukraine and around Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, yes.
My name is Mayumi Watanabe. I come from Platts Metals Week. We cover the mining industry, which is very important for Ukraine. My question is, you said the economic sanctions were starting to pay off, and that economic sanctions were a very effective weapon against Russia. Could you elaborate further on how the economic sanctions have influenced Russia?
I just read headlines from world news and papers yesterday and today. And also some insight from reliable Russian sources, because still there are reliable Russian sources, despite the fact that Russian public media is hugely manipulated and it's difficult. I recall the Soviet times. We had the term Sovietology at that time. You read Soviet papers, and you should read in between the lines to understand what's happening. That's, to a great extent, the situation with Russian media today. But luckily enough, we still have sources which you may rely upon. Now, basic facts, as they are reported even by Russian media, for today's is that Russian currency in these last 2 days had fallen, I think, about 20%. Stock market for the single day yesterday has fallen 14%. I'm not a big economist, but my economic advisors are saying that that's a free fall. Of course, not only economic sanctions add to that economic effect, but also economic sanctions. There had been huge debate about the oil price recently. But you should not be a big economist to understand that if the national revenue depends 70% on your income from exporting oil, that means that oil price matters. And we remember the Russian leader in April, just after annexation of Crimea, asked at some press conference in Russia, he was asked what the Russian government would do if oil price drops less than $85 per barrel. Reply then was, it will not, because it is highly hypothetical and principally impossible. One of my Arab colleagues told me yesterday that the price was less than 60 today. Now, several weeks ago, that same leader of Russian Federation was asked at the press conference in Milano, where he was admitted to a group of top world leaders, what the Russian government will do if a ruble drops to 41 against dollar. And he replied, in inadequate manner with a joke, that it will never happen. I mean, literally. There were reports that ruble was selling 80 yesterday. So you need not to be a big economist to elaborate on how sanctions influence economy. The big issue is that having this totally manipulated media environment in Russia, important thing is that an average Russian citizen, usual customer of daily services in Russia, would finally understand the linkage between the adventurous policies of his government or her government and the current economic situation Russia is going to. It's simple. And the link is, it is because of Crimea. It is because of Crimea. And when this simple truth is brought to an average mind of a Russian citizen, then there is a hope that the current Russian government puts itself to reason and pretends to behave responsibly. That is why the strategy which Ukrainian partners had taken formulated by some top political figures in terms that Russia would pay the price. I think time is coming to a fact that Russia is starting to pay the price already. What kind of price it will be in the final end, that's a big question mark still, and no big clarity on this. Let's hope that this coming to reason comes sooner. And the recipe is quite simple. Canadian Prime Minister put it in a nutshell in Brisbane: get out of Ukraine. Very simple. If the Russian government shows its readiness to get out of Ukraine, it still would be difficult to recover from current economic situation Russia is in. But at least there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. With the current policies, question mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Masato Tainaka from the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. My question is about the Budapest Memorandum, which you mentioned. It's about the nuclear weapons. And you mentioned that the Budapest Memorandum for the nuclear weapons, but as far as I know, the Russians argue that the negative security assurance is only about the nuclear weapons, but the current dispute in Ukraine has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. How would you respond to this? This is the first question. And the second one is, anyway, the Russians and the Americans have been committing to the New START reduction, nuclear reductions. So Russians argue they are promoting the nuclear disarmament. But how would you respond to this? And would you see any implication toward the next year's nuclear weapons NPT review conference? And also, you also mentioned Hiroshima. And would you see any Japan's role which could contribute to the ease the tension between the Ukrainians and the Russians? Thank you very much.
On Budapest Memorandum, if you read carefully the wordings there, and if you have good legal education and political insight, you may definitely go along the line which Russia is taking part and forgetting about the other. That is exactly the case. Memorandum is not ideal, but it states clearly the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So there is no any doubt about gross direct violation on the Russian side of this memorandum. But memorandum is a political document. Russia had violated much more important legally valid documents, including the big treaty between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, which stipulated mutual recognition of existing borders and territorial integrity. Moreover, it violated nothing less than the United Nations United Nations Charter. I have the list of provisions of the United Nations Charter which Russia its member, who, by the way, got its seat in the United Nations, Russia. Ukraine was the original member of the United Nations back in 1945. Russia was not existent at that time. It was the Soviet Union. Just a historical trick. Russia got its seat after all former Soviet republics have agreed that Russia will continue in the place of the former Soviet Union at the United Nations. To sum up on this first question, any argument which Russia is providing today for whatever reasons to bring some at least feel of legality for its actions against Ukraine are void and null from the inception. It's just basic. It's just this cover is white, simple. But if you have Russian on the other side and he is arguing that it is green, it is very difficult. You should bring an optician or physician or whoever, a concilium. On nuclear disarmament, I just read the line. Situation is not only difficult in that terms of NPT and other nuclear-related treaties, but proceeding from what had been ruined after Russia went this way. Politically, Ukraine renouncing its nuclear potential, third world nuclear potential, back in 1994, had relied upon the political assurances from big countries, practically all of them P5s. 3 had signed together in Budapest, Russia, United Kingdom, United States. France and China made several statements, but to the same effect. Unilateral statements. So all P5. Now what we have? The state had renounced nuclear weapons, got assurances, and was invaded by one of the assurers. What type of political signal may it bring to those who wish to acquire these nuclear weapons and NPT in general? Think about it. I think that's one of the big but still hidden issues, which is a direct influence of that Russia's policies in Ukraine since March this year. One last thing on Japanese policies and possible additional support. I think this nuclear field is one quite naturally filling into what Japanese governments, successive governments, after the war had been putting as one of the priority issues in their external policies. Ukraine had always been together with Japan on this. We, as a country which suffered from the worst nuclear disaster of peaceful manner, if I may say, in Chernobyl, and Japan, as a country who suffered the worst Hiroshima experience, military nuclear potential, they are just naturally bound together on this. We both speak for nuclear-free world. And I think the voice of Japan, specifically if Japan wants to be, and I understand it wants to be, more active on global security issues, including in the United Nations Security Council, then that is just a very natural approach for any Japanese politician, any Japanese government to look at. We have a case now. We have a case now. We have a territory of nuclear-free country who renounced nuclear weapons. Now its neighbor wants to bring back nuclear weapons to its territory. I thank you.
Okay, any last questions before we wrap it up? Okay, time is short, so short question and short answer, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Roger Sharon, an independent. I understand that the invasion of Crimea and the loss of these territories have created a lot of economic chaos. We mentioned some of the natural resources and mining. I'm just briefly curious, what does Ukraine's economic plans, what are you trying to do to improve the situation and new relationships with European Union and things to go forward? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a big question. Situation is economically far from being good. No big secret. It is very hard. It is very hard. Ukraine has been in political turmoil since the end of last year, which eventually developed into what we call a revolution. Now it is, I think, with all the reasons that we may call it, with the military invasion, occupation of the part of territory, and still ongoing war, and the devastating effect of that war in the eastern part of Ukraine, where lots of infrastructure had been simply destroyed. Of course, Ukraine is in a very difficult economic situation today. As I mentioned already, this new Ukrainian government had adopted a far-reaching program of speedy reform. To put it in a nutshell, Prime Minister a couple of days ago mentioned it that his ambition would be for the year 2015 to become the year of stabilization. Stabilization, just not the full recovery, stabilization. It's a temperate assessment. For this, we of course need peace. At the background of the fact that still 5% of the national budget would go for defense and security, which is the biggest figure since the inception of Ukrainian independence. Until recently, we had 1%, 1.2 max. Now it's 5, for reasons I think I need not to explain. Ukrainian currency is also not in such a speedy manner as ruble, but falling. But once again, that is more or less understandable at the background of what Ukraine is living through, which is war and annexation of the part of territory and the destruction of the heavily industrialized regions in the east. Now, the good side of the story is Ukraine is being supported worldwide, including by big names. And just very recently, last week news, I already referred to the meeting, I think what yesterday or the day before yesterday, of this association, EU-Ukraine Council. A package of additional assistance from the EU had been discussed and it's underway. The United States had promised full support economically, also via the IMF and the World Bank. And the mission, I think the mission will be coming to assess either even before the new year or shortly after the new year. So it's in the tunnel. What else? That's economically. I didn't mention one important political development of recent week, which is not necessarily 100% economical, but I think it will have economic effect. Both houses of the US legislation had voted unanimously for the Freedom Support Act of Ukraine. And the document is awaiting the signature of the United States President. A document which puts Ukraine basically into the position of the main ally of the United States outside current NATO, which, I mean, some experts claim that way also make an effect not only on Russian minds, but also on minds of those who would wish to look for economic opportunities in Ukraine. The program of reconstruction of the territories of East Ukraine, which had been devastated in the war, is now in preparation. Beginning of the next year, the donor conference, pledging conference for these ends will be organized in Ukraine. And the Japanese government, as we understand, had already expressed its, and many other governments had expressed their interests in participating. So, there is one thing that is readiness to support and help, which Ukraine is enjoying today. At the background of quite difficult economic situation we are living through. So, in Latin terms, being in war, being in economic hardship, contra spem spero. That is, we still hope, and we remain optimists that the year 2015 would be the year of stabilization. And we will eventually overcome the war hardships, return our territories, and hopefully find a good tune with the new Russian government. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Ambassador Kharchenko. I think that many of us have learned a lot during this press conference. And as we've said, it's the third one of the year. Our hope is that we'll invite him or one of his successors back in the future, and we'll get a press conference on the peaceful Ukraine and its economic miracle and much better times in the future. How did the Ukrainians rise to such a prosperous state? So I hope that we do have that press conference in the near future. So thank you very much for coming. This is your extension of your honorary membership of this club. So thank you for coming, and we expect to see you here many more times.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that concludes our event for today. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you all soon.